And thanks to all of you for making it out this morning. I know it wasn't easy. I'm also dripping wet here. So we know from a lot of work, especially over the last couple decades, that languages are impressively distinct from one another. So the question I'm going to try to address today is why and how do we learn the conventions of a language? And I think it's worth stepping back and asking what it is we need to do. And it's clear that we need to understand messages given forms for the sake of comprehension. And we also need to choose the forms in order to express the messages that we want to convey for the sake of production. So given those two simple facts, it seems clear that what we need to do is learn and use form-function pairings or constructions. So we actually like to talk about a lot of different situations. And luckily, we have different constructions that correspond to differences in function. So many phrasal constructions their function involves information structure, or their function is discourse related. So we have the topicalization construction where the fronted noun phrase is a new topic, like CUNY, I love it, and you're likely to introduce CUNY into the discourse and continue talking about it. And that can be compared, sorry, that was left dislocation. Topicalization, where you have a gap, like CUNY, I love, is often used for moribund topics, that is, things you've already talked about, but you're not likely to continue talking about. Other constructions convey attitude, so the NP him, the leader of the free world, the incredulity construction, or why read the newspaper, evokes disapproval or skepticism. And a construction that I've recently started working on with Thomas Erbst is exemplified by "it's good of you to have come." And it's clear that it requires that the speaker judges someone's action evaluatively. So you can't say it's tall of you to reach the top shelf. You can say it's big of you to reach the top shelf, but in that case, big doesn't mean big, it means something like generous. It has to be applied to an animate, so you wouldn't say it's helpful of the dishwasher to save water. And this is true in general for phrasal patterns. There's some sort of function. So the double object construction, if I asked you what moop means, and she mooped him something, more than half of you will think of give. And others will come up with verbs that are closely related to give. And that's not an accident, because the conditional probability of give, given that you have the double object construction, is about 0.5. Does anyone have any water? Sorry, it's okay. And if you look at all instances of the double object construction, oh, it's okay, it's okay. Okay, sorry. If you look at the double object construction in corpus data and then you have independent raters decide whether the sentence involves literal or metaphorical transfer. So one of these blues is, the bright blue is literal transfer in speech to children, and the dark blue is metaphorical transfer. And it encodes transfer 94% of the time. And in fact, in more recent work, we found that Jabberwocky sentences with no open clause words, so things like she jorped him the fap, primes high-frequency associates like the word give, it primes low-frequency associates like handed, and it also primes semantically related non-associates, that is, verbs that are semantically related to the meaning but don't actually occur often in the construction, like transferred. How does this matter? Because when you're using the verb give, you already know that transfer is involved. Well, notice that there's a slight difference in meaning between Joe baked Sam a cake, which is an instance of the double object construction, and Joe baked a cake for Sam. The second one only can be used when Joe is baking a cake instead of Sam. You wouldn't say Joe baked Sam a cake in this context. You also wouldn't say Joe baked Sam a cake if Joe intends to throw the cake at Sam. Okay, and you see these subtle differences in different constructions. Whenever a verb has a choice between two constructions, there's a difference in function. So it would be fine to welcome someone at a wedding by saying, welcome Joe, who just married into the family, but it means something very different to say, welcome Joe, who married his way into the family. So Humboldt long ago observed that natural language is a means to allow infinite use of finite means. And so one way to understand this on a constructionist approach is that the constructions have open slots, and the slots can be of different sizes, including sentential slots. So in English, the verb is often a very open slot. We can say very creative things like, I grabbed the guy by the collar of his flowered shirt, popped him a punch. Or a 15-year-old Googled his way to revolutionizing cancer detection. Or Mike couldn't believe she had managed to flirt his wallet open again. We find frequent verbs occurring in a multitude of different constructions with slightly different interpretations depending on the construction involved. So these are some examples with sneeze. Each one of these involves a slightly different interpretation. And in English, of course, we can use nouns as verbs. So we can say, I'm going to go Benadryl myself to sleep, or he out-trumped himself. Or my favorite, few people want to be memorialized umming, you knowing, and remember that time when we got drunking their way into infamy. Okay, so English is particularly productive in what kinds of verbs can occur in the slot of these constructions. But at the same time, speakers are not wholly productive in their use of constructions. There are odd gaps in what native speakers find natural. So it's odd to say she explained him the story, or he vanished the rabbit, or the asleep boy. And none of these is due to system-wide constraints in the language, as you can tell by looking at similar cases that have similar meaning or similar phonology. And these are acceptable. So explain is odd in the double object, but tell is fine, and guarantee is fine. Okay, and that's true with all of these cases. Okay, now we know that kids don't reliably get feedback from their caregivers. So if a child says, "Me loves you, mommy," it would be an unusual parent who would slap the kid and correct their grammar. And conversely, if a child produced in perfectly grammatical English, "I have just completed a colorful mural on my bedroom wall with indelible markers," the parent is not likely to give them a hug. That is, we're more interested in children's content than in their forms. So we'll get rid of that idea. Okay, so how are construction generalizations constrained? And the idea that I've been working with for a while is that they're statistically preempted. The idea is that people learn to avoid certain grammatical possibilities by systematically witnessing a competing alternative. So we know this is the case for words, and the constructionist approach draws strong parallels between what we know about words and these phrasal constructions. So, and I do think that the same kind of approach carries over very nicely. That is, if you're in a situation like this, and you might expect to hear one of two things. You might expect to hear, "The magician made the rabbit disappear," or the simple transitive, "The magician disappeared the rabbit." But native speakers don't actually say the second one very often, so you're much more likely to hear, "The magician made the rabbit disappear," the paraphrastic causative. And upon hearing that, if both of the other representations were partially active, you're likely to strengthen the paraphrastic and weaken the causative. Okay, so let's apply this to a particular case. So one of the odd constraints that I mentioned is the fact that certain adjectives that begin with an unstressed schwa, like asleep, don't sound natural before nouns. So it's odd to say the asleep child. And again, it's fine to say the sleeping child or the astute child. So it's not strictly semantics or phonology. And they're actually a class of adjectives that all resist appearing before nouns in attributive use. There's a historical motivation for this, so here's my nod to language evolution. So in Old English, these A adjectives used to be prepositional phrases. So asleep came from, in Old English, in sleep. And because it was used frequently, it became reduced, and it ultimately became one word that's now reanalyzed as an adjective. When they were prepositions, it made sense that they couldn't occur before nouns because we don't use prepositions before nouns. We wouldn't say the on drugs man. Interestingly, not all of the A adjectives were prepositional phrases. So afraid didn't come from on frayed. Instead, afraid was a past participle of a verb. But speakers seem to have generalized the restriction to include afraid into the category. So what this means is that synchronically, of course, most of us know the history of the language, and if we did, we wouldn't use it in our speech. it requires that speakers have to keep track of how adjectives have been used. And luckily, this isn't big news to this particular audience, the idea that you're keeping track of how words are used. But what I want to emphasize is that you're keeping track of how words are used in particular constructions. So in a production study with Jeremy Boyd, we asked two questions. One is, would novel A adjectives, could we see this process of including a new A adjective in the category of A adjectives with a new nonsense word? And we also tested the idea of statistical preemption. So the experiment was very simple. People saw two animals like this, two foxes. They were labeled dead and alive. One of them moved to the star. I know it doesn't look very dead, but the screen went blank, and then we simply asked people which fox moved to the star. And we had 4 conditions. In one condition, we used real A adjectives like asleep. In another, we used near synonyms like sleepy. In another, we used nonsense A adjectives like effect, and we pronounced them for people. And in the last one, we used nonsense non-A adjectives. We also included fillers because you can imagine in a production study, particularly, people would be very likely to be primed. But it turns out that if you use prototypical adjectives, people overwhelmingly produce the attributive prenominal use because it's a contrastive context. And if you use, and we also included examples where the animals were labeled with present tense verbs because you can't say the Camp's cow moved to the star. So you have to use a relative clause, that is the preemptive context, like the cow that was Camp's, the cow that Camp, sorry, moved to the star. Okay. So we gave them 6 practice trials to explain that we wanted them to use full sentences, but none of the practice trials didn't bias them in one way or another. I mentioned them just because I'm going to come back to them in the second experiment. Okay. So we can see that, in fact, the judgments are verified. People do avoid using A adjectives prenominally, even in a contrastive context. So asleep avoids the prenominal use. The y-axis is the number of prenominal uses, much more than its near synonym sleepy. Interestingly, this was also true of effect, the nonsense A adjective. So it was assimilated to the category to some extent. But if you're looking at the y-axis, you might notice that here's the data all at once. There's an interaction. So the effect is much stronger for the real A adjectives than for the nonsense A adjectives. Okay, so in a second study, we wanted to test this idea of statistical preemption. So we simply introduced that in the pre-exposure blocks. So now we'd show people examples like this, Zeki and Afek, and then we'd say, so for example, here you might say the fox that's Afek moved to the star. Again, we included 6 practice trials. Again, they weren't overall biased toward the relative clause, so there were also instances of prenominal use. 2 of the novel A adjectives, though, were witnessed in a preempting context, 2 out of 4 of the novel adjectives. So remember what we saw in experiment 1? It looked like this. In the second experiment with this minimal preemptive exposure, people's productions are like this and the interaction disappears. That is, effect and asleep behave the same way. Thank you so much, Ted. I'm so sorry.
My fault.
Okay, no. Okay, oh, that's much better. Thank you, guys. You're great. Thank you so much. Ooh, this is cold. Wonderful.
Mine's fresh.
And if you take a look within the category of nonsense A adjectives and look at the ones that had been preempted versus the ones that hadn't been preempted, there's actually very little difference. That is, people assimilated the restriction. So upon witnessing 2 of the nonsense A adjectives in a preemptive context, they assimilated all the novel A adjectives in this experimental context to the category. Now, there was recently a critique of the idea of statistical preemption. Charles Yang did a corpus analysis of input to children. He looked at about a year's worth of data that was spoken to children before they were 3 years old. And found that there wasn't enough preemptive exposure for kids to learn this A adjective restriction. But it turns out, oh, I didn't mean to leave that on that one, sorry. That was rude. Well, it turns out that a senior thesis student at Princeton did a study like the first study with the A adjectives, and it turns out that kids don't actually know this restriction until they're about 10 years old. So they do need a lot of time before they learn this restriction on A adjectives. Okay. So it's useful to look at naturalistic contexts, and A adjectives are, a real example with a restriction. But we know that the A adjective restriction already exists for English-speaking adults, and so maybe that made the preemptive exposure work especially well. So I'm going to turn our attention to artificial language studies, and I want to introduce them by recalling a classic study by Wanacott, Newport, and Tannenhouse, where they introduced learners to two constructions that had different word orders. So one construction was the VAP construction, so verb, agent, patient, and the other one was verb, patient, agent with a little marker on the agent, ka, verb, patient, agent. They gave different groups of learners different kinds of exposure. So in the lexical input condition, none of the verbs in the input alternated. And then they found in a production task that people showed completely conservative behavior. That is, they used the verbs exactly how they had been witnessed in those same constructions. When a third of the verbs alternated during exposure, people were minimally productive, but they still showed a strong lexical bias. Only when all of the verbs alternated in the input did people show productive behavior. But recall that in natural languages, every construction has its own ecological niche. So we've been working with novel construction learning studies, and the difference between those and artificial language learning is that we expose learners to pairings of novel form and novel meaning. So we create some abstract meaning and associate it with the construction. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about two studies. The first one, and it's going to be consistently labeled in red, APV. The P is bold-faced because here's the scene, P is the patient. The patient is strongly affected. Let me just show you that one more time in case you blinked. Okay. And in the other construction, PAV, the agent is not, the patient is not particularly affected, but the action is the same. Okay. So we had different characters and different actions, different novel verbs, and they were all counterbalanced. Okay, so in what follows, I'm going to be reminding you of that strong effect on the patient with this with this rectangle showing the big effect, the strong effect, and I'll be reminding you of the small effect with this square. Okay, so in this experiment, we gave people 2 days of exposure. It takes some time to learn two different novel constructions. So they just saw 36 sentence scene pairs, each verb used 6 times, and participants were asked to repeat each sentence. We had 2 input conditions. One was a lexical condition in which people saw 3 verbs only in one construction and 3 verbs only in the other construction. And we had a partially alternating condition where 2 out of the 6 verbs were seen in both, with correspondingly different interpretations. And then we gave them both production and sentence rating tasks. I'm only going to show you the production task, but the sentence ratings tasks are completely consistent in their findings. But in the production task, we asked people to describe new scenes, and in some cases, we provided novel new verbs, or new novel verbs. Okay, and we interspersed these with distractor tasks to avoid priming. So we gave them vocabulary questions, forced choice, sentence comprehension. So the lexical condition then looked like this. Remember, each construction has its own function. So APV has a strong effect, PAV has a weak effect. In the alternating condition, the constructions stay the same. 2 verbs occur in both constructions, though. Okay, so again, here's another production trial. Okay, and people were asked simply what happened here, and the verb was provided. And so they could use one of the 2 constructions. Okay, what we find is that participants recognize the distinct functions of the two constructions, and they use verbs in semantically congruent constructions. So here's what it's going to look like. On the y-axis is proportion of congruent responses in red and congruent responses of the PAV in blue. So if we look at novel verbs where there was no previous input, I mean, they're all novel verbs, but these are new novel verbs. What you can see is that the scene has a strong impact. So if you cut this box down the middle, you can't flip it over. It's different on both sides because the context is playing a strong role in the productions. People are producing the small effect scenes in the small effect construction and the strong effect scenes in the strong effect construction. But what happens when they had some input? Well, it turns out in the alternating case, even though only 2 out of 6 of the verbs alternated, people are completely productive. They overlook the statistics in the input, the verb-specific statistics in the input. This is different from what Wanacott found, where she found if a third of the verbs alternated, you only got minimal productivity. What about in the lexical condition in which none of the verbs were witnessed alternating? Here again, you see a strong effect of context. But you also see some lexical effect. That is, these are the PAV-only verbs, and there's more blue in that box. And these are the strong red verbs, and there's more red in this box. Nonetheless, you get a main effect of effect, although, again, it is stronger in the alternating condition. Okay, so participants generalize novel constructions in contextually appropriate ways. There's a tendency to ignore verb-specific input to better express the intended message. Alternating verbs do promote productivity, but you get, in this experiment, full generalization even when only a third of the verbs alternate. And we've done this with other meanings of the construction, so we've published a different study with information structure properties associated with the construction. And again, we find very parallel results. We did this one. Okay, oh, good, okay, I can slow down. So we did this study because if the constructions differ in terms of information structure, people might have a prior tendency to understand that information structure is not usually conditioned by verbs. Okay. So again, we want to ask about statistical preemption. So do you get statistical preemption if you don't have prior knowledge that there is a restriction? So this was the exposure in the lexicalist condition, where you did see generalization, remember. We're going to look at something that's very similar to this. So so far it's identical to what the lexical exposure was, 3 verbs in the strong effect construction and 3 verbs in the weak effect construction. But one of those verbs was witnessed in both constructions. And the idea is that this is the preemptive exposure because this verb was witnessed appearing in this construction even with the other, this verb was witnessed in the weak construction even though the context was a strong effect. Okay. Once again, people were able to learn the function of the 2 constructions. So with new novel verbs, they show the same pattern they had showed before. They use these new novel verbs in ways that are congruent with the construction. The preempted verb is successfully preempted, so it only occurred in the blue construction, and you see that it was almost always produced in the blue only construction. Interestingly, other verbs were also used fairly conservatively. So there's more red for the red verbs, and there's more blue for the blue verbs. Okay, although you do see an overall tendency to also obey the construction. Okay, boy, I thought I often give this talk in an hour, but I was trying to talk really fast, and despite the crunch that Steve told us about yesterday. So I'm going to give you the big picture, and then I'm happy to answer questions. You probably have a lot because I only gave you sort of the tip of the iceberg of this kind of approach to language. But the idea is that language users learn pairings of form and function, that is constructions, beyond the level of words. And we do that in every language, although in English, these argument structure patterns are particularly productive. We do this by recording how particular constructions have been used, and that involves noting the contextual information associated with the scenes involved. The exemplars that we witness have to cluster in a very high dimensional similarity space, allowing for generalizations to emerge. So that is, we talk about everything. Word meaning can cover every topic that we can talk about, and we have to situate those word labels with that kind of contextual information. We have to associate constructions with discourse properties, with meanings, with attitudes. We have to learn how each construction is used in our language. We use constructions productively in order to better suit our intended message. So that's when we get creative, when there's no conventional way to express what we want to express, we get creative. We restrict productivity via this error-driven learning, which I'm calling statistical preemption. So if we expect something else, but we hear the canonical form, we get an error signal, and that leads us to strengthen the conventional formulation and weaken the novel formulation. And interestingly, the restrictions themselves can be generalized. So we don't need to see evidence of every single case if the group forms a cluster. We can generalize. And again, if you think about words, none of this is new. We know this about words and how they are regular and irregular. So we know we can generalize restrictions on novel verbs as well. Okay, I want to thank especially my collaborators, Florent Perec on the second set of experiments and Jeremy Boyd on the first, and also, of course, all my lab. And thank you again for getting out in the morning.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. We said tenured people here, non-tenured there.
That was a great talk. Thanks, Adele. I was just wondering, in the very last few minutes of your talk, about how our language system, or the mind in general, deals with incongruency of constructions used in an appropriate context. Because on the one hand, you could argue that it would elicit the same kind of, like an N400, say, effect in ERPs, where you really can't integrate things easily meaning-wise, or it could be the same kind of thing that elicits these very domain general, like error correction signals, where you're like, okay, they just haven't quite learned the form. Do we know anything about that?
That's a really good question. I'd love to do that experiment. We do have some behavioral studies so we've created novel sentences, and some of them have a readily available alternative, and some of them don't. Mm-hmm. And we find that so there's a difference in judgments. People disprefer the novel sentences where there is some more natural way to say it, and I expect, in general, if there's a more natural way to say it, you should get a P600, right? Because you would see an error and fix it. Yeah. But if there is no other way to say it, and you need to use this, I bet then you might get an N400, right? Because it's novel. Yeah. Thanks, Zach. Josh.
Hi, Adele. Oh,
Hey.
Josh Hartshorn, Boston College. So that was really neat talk. I really enjoyed the last experiment, just set of experiments. I want to put in a plug. Melissa Klein and Jesse Snedeker are putting together a repository of stimuli videos of events. If you have not already submitted those events, I really hope you will.
Absolutely. I didn't know about that. Terrific. Yeah, it'd be great to share events.
But the question that I wanted to ask was about the psychological status of statistical preemption and its arch nemesis entrenchment, which is, I totally believe in the phenomenon. One of the things that stands out is that both of them seem to be in aspects of what you would get from Bayesian inference, right? So if you have a prior for simplicity on your grammar, then anytime you see one thing, that makes everything else less likely.
That's right.
Right. And so my question is, are we really just labeling something that is really Bayesian inference, or is this potentially or are these stories on different MAR levels where Bayesian inference is the right sort of descriptive theory, but preemption and entrenchment, which might be a little bit simpler to calculate in real time, are the actual like algorithmic and real-time story of how the learning happens, or none of the above?
Okay, great question. So just for those of you who aren't up on the fiery debate, entrenchment is the idea that you only use what you've heard, and the more you've heard it, the more conservative you are with it. And preemption is different. It makes similar predictions, but the difference is that you don't have to be conservative. You can be creative if you have something new to say. So that is, you are preempted not by something that's more frequent overall, but something that's more frequent and conveys the same message. So the context is really important. To date, so Ben Ombridge is the one who has promoted the entrenchment idea most strongly, and we recently collaborated, and he redid the analyses of those papers, and because of the way they were coded, he's actually coming down in favor of preemption too. Let me just explain, and actually, I have a postdoc, Libby Barak, who has a Bayesian model that involves preemption as a side effect, right? Because you get you're deciding between two clusters, and you want to look for the best fit. Well, so the fit has to be relevant, right? And the size of the cluster matters too. But if you've said something else more frequently, but it doesn't mean the same thing, it doesn't matter, right? So let me just give you a quick, I always ask myself, what would words do? And that always gives me a good intuition. So we know that, for instance, ran preempts run, right? There's really no question about it. Now, there are other verbs that are more frequent. Say we never, we didn't hear ran, we heard walked a lot, much more frequent, or go, we heard went, so let's say went, we heard went many, many more times. But it doesn't preempt run, right? It's not relevant because it doesn't express the same meaning. Now, again, constructions don't, okay, one little caveat here, and this is why people haven't applied preemption to phrasal forms. They don't mean exactly the same thing, right? I made a big deal of that in the beginning, in fact. They don't mean the same thing. And so Pinker, for example, suggested at one point that preemption might work, but then he dismissed it because of that fact that constructions encode different meanings. But that doesn't mean that preemption can't work, because what you have to look for are contexts where one construction would normally be appropriate, but you hear the other anyway, right? You hear it despite the fact that there's some other construction that would be more appropriate. That's when you get the preemptive exposure. Sorry, so offline, I could give you a ton more. We have some studies comparing the two, and I do think that context matters. Thanks, Josh. Oh, okay. Oh, yes.
I didn't quite
Whitney,
catch
yes.
the, is there like, is it okay? Okay. I didn't know about these microphones. So I wanted to ask for a clarification on the part about creativity, about creative uses. And it's the thing that I think is particularly interesting about this kind of work is that it's sort of pushing at the question, what is the status of the system, which standardly is called the grammar, with respect to these forces that operate on our behavior and which can be often characterized well in statistical terms. So it seems like when you speak of the creative behavior, you're talking about the kind of case that would traditionally be called violating the grammar or going out of the system in some sense. I don't know if that's aligned with your way of thinking about it, but I wanted to know, what is the nature of that bound for you? Is there a system which is able to say, this is the rule, this is the way to do it, and then is there a notion of crossing the boundary when you sometimes don't do what the system says, that is somehow pushed that way by these statistical forces?
Okay, no, I actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's actually not what I meant by being creative. I mean being creative just the way every linguist does, that we use new formulations. So in English, I was giving examples that are obviously creative, like the pop me a punch, or flirt his wallet open. You don't have to have heard it, but those aren't, no, I don't think people would say they're unacceptable, right? They are licensed, but they're not familiar, they're novel.
But, well, okay, I guess I was
So
interested.
do you create a new construction, you mean?
Yeah, does this have a way, this approach have a way to talk about cases where the grammar actually changes, sort of in the spirit of the question of languages being mutable and the system evolves over time?
So you can get that, that kind of effect, but you don't get dramatic changes very often because in a existing language, you have a means to express almost every idea. So it's, the unique kinds of situations that you have to combine things in new ways. But, you can create new utterances, an infinite number of utterances by combining constructions in new ways. So, but occasionally you do buck the trends for expressive power. So let me just give you one example. I said you don't say he vanished it, but in some situations you can say he disappeared them, right? And we don't say he disappeared the rabbit, we still don't say that. But people innovated, they disappeared them in a political context because it was particularly expressive, right? It laid the responsibility directly on they, right, on the subject argument. You wanted a direct causative. And so it was innovated, and it is used still in that particular context.
Okay, I would just put in a plug that the theory needs to be able to do that in some sense. There needs to be a mechanism.
Dynamic system.
Well, whatever system, the system of grammar needs to be able to step over that boundary somehow. The theory needs a way to explain how that happens. So
How languages change?
Yeah, in particular in the cases where it's...
Okay, well, I would say, yeah, they change as the statistics changes in the language. It can, it slowly changes, usually by adolescence. I mean, there's a lot of work on grammaticalization and constructualization, and I think that's the right approach, right? You're looking for very frequent patterns that get reduced, and then something gets added because of emphasis, and that's how new constructions are born. So it's piecemeal. It's not like a dramatic change overnight.
Okay.
Well, Ev.
Question about, I don't know if we know about this, but like to the extent that people are consistent, is that some people innovate more than others? Do we know if that relates to other kinds of creativity, or if anybody has looked at that?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm curious about that, right? Because we have a lot of online judgments, and we could give them personality tests,
yeah.
right? I bet there is some
Yeah.
generalization there. Yeah, thanks.
Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yes. So I've been thinking about error-driven learning. So this is a mechanism for, adding a new construction to your grammar or, learning an alternation that maybe wasn't there before. But oftentimes when we hear something that's unexpected, it truly is an error, right? We make performance errors all the time. So how does this fit in with this overall picture of, when something's truly an error and when something we should think about changing how we are using our language?
Okay, good. So it's importantly incremental. It's statistical. So if you hear one person saying, explain me something, it's just that one person saying it. If you continue to hear a context where people say, explain this to me, which is the preferred form for native speakers, continually the to me will get strengthened and the double object version would get weakened. But the more people who start to use it in the double object, the more those statistics will change. And over time, it could be that new generations are exposed to a language in which both are possible.
Yeah, I've got a lot of Italian friends, so I hear a lot of, explain me this. So
Okay, very good, very good.
I hear this a lot, so it's not that I don't hear it. I hear
Good.
it quite frequently, but I have not decided to actually explain you anything.
Okay, very, very good. And there, I want to emphasize this very high dimensional space and the fact that we've learned how things are used in contexts. So you know that your non-native speaker friends use this, but it's localized to that context. That's a cluster of usages that you understand. But if a wide variety of people did it, it would become the norm. So we know when we hear something from a dialect because we hear it only in a limited situation. So the work by Kleinschmidt and Jaeger finds something like this for phonology. And I think it transfers over.
So I just wanted to follow up on
Yes.
that because I say give it me a lot because I
Yeah,
just
that-
like people to give me stuff. But, and you just drew a distinction, which is, I'm glad you drew, which is the difference between, say, one person saying it a lot and a whole community of people saying it maybe not so much. What is it that you use to account for what I assume is a difference, where if the community uses it, that's going to now shift me, whereas if I just say give it me a lot, people aren't going to shift?
Okay, good. So we know that's true. What was who gave the talk who showed exactly that? I'm having source confusion. Sorry? Sherry. Okay, thank you. Yes, exactly that point was made yesterday. Well, you're looking at like an incredibly complicated system where, again, context is tied to how you're using things. And so, if every person who uses give it me, which isn't standard English, but it is British English, is British, that fact, it's all in English. Give it me? Actually, I looked it up once. It's not preferred, but it's in corpora much more than English. But much more than standard English, sorry. But, I mean, I'm sorry, God. Standard American English, I'm sorry. And the real question is, how do we know which dimensions are relevant? And I don't have a good answer to that. Like, how does the kid know that information structure is the thing that's relevant to topicalization and left dislocation, and semantics is more relevant to the cause-motion construction? How do we, and the question is multiplied when you think of word meaning, right? How do kids know that the meaning of breakfast has to do with breakfast? I don't think we have a good theory of how we pick out the right meanings for anything, the right associations with anything, but we track a lot of very specific information.